Hello! Today, we're in Train Simulator by Railworks, in the southwest corner of Pennsylvania, to talk about the Monongahela Railway, and to take a trip up into the mountains to the Emerald Mine in Waynesburg, Pennsylvania. We are on the Norfolk Southern Coal District map, which comes with the game, and it's an area that I didn't know anything about and wasn't all that interested in either, to be honest. I don't know if the Brownsville street-running trains are more well-known in train fan circles elsewhere throughout the country, but the only reason I learned of it at all was because it was included in this game. The reason these videos ended up coming about was that I thought it would be fun to take a Challenger up the mountain with a big heavy coal train. Everybody knows the Union Pacific locomotives. They're very popular, especially because, there's one that actually runs. But I've always been more fascinated with East Coast Challengers. The Clinchfield Railroad ran them over the Appalachian Mountains in Virginia and North Carolina. The Western Maryland Railroad had a dozen of them, and the Delaware and Hudson had 40 Class J Challengers that hauled coal out of Scranton. Since I would be using a steam locomotive, I thought it would be more interesting to see if I could make the time period feel more like the 40s or 50s, and then I began to wonder what the original railroad had been in the area long before Norfolk Southern took over, and if maybe I could place some steam locomotives and rolling stock that would have been appropriate. The results of that research is what I'll be presenting here over the course of 3 episodes. Challengers never ran on the Monongahela, but here in the game, for fun, the scenario is going to be that the railroad has requested a test run to explore the possibility of purchasing some, and the Clinchfield Railroad has obliged by sending up a locomotive and a crew for a few days. So this is the RSC Challenger, which is a DLC available to buy through the game. It's about $10, but painted in the Clinchfield colors, which is a texture set by Chad Tanner. I'm also using the updated physics pack for the engine by David Whiting, as well as the Challenger whistle and bell fix by Tony Wynn. We are heading north on the Monongahela Railway main lines, hauling a full coal train from Fairmont, West Virginia, to Brownsville, Pennsylvania, just a few miles up ahead of us. We have 60 Pennsylvania H21A coal hoppers in tow behind us. These are each 42 feet in length, so including our 33-foot caboose, our train is 2,553 feet long today. That's just shy of a half a mile. Now that may not seem like much in light of stories of trains out west pulling mile-long freights up over the mountains, but let's not forget that this isn't mixed freight, it's pure coal, which generally is much heavier. So at 70 tons per car, again plus an 11-ton caboose, plus the almost 2 million pounds of locomotive itself, we're pulling 4,759 tons through the Pennsylvania countryside. To put that into perspective, that's the equivalent of a Farragut-class destroyer. With only a single locomotive, we could pull a Cold War-era warship along at 25 or 30 miles an hour. That's pretty impressive. Welcome to the cab of our Clinchfield E-Class Challenger, running number 651. Clinchfield ran a total of 18 Challengers in the late 40s and early 50s, hauling coal and freight from Kentucky and Virginia down to South Carolina. This locomotive was an E1, one of 8 delivered to the railroad in 1942 and 43. 4 E2s arrived later in 1947. Both E1s and E2s were retired in 1954, and the E1s were cut up for scrap in the fall of 1955. The E2s sat around a little bit longer, not being scrapped until 1962. These two classes were almost identical to the Delaware and Hudson Challengers, but 6 additional Challengers were sold to Clinchfield by the Union Pacific in 1947. Other than small tweaks to heating surface areas in the firebox, these 6 were identical to all other Union Pacific Challengers. The E3s were also retired in 1954, with the rest of the E-Class locomotives in favor of dieselization. E1s were numbered 650 through 657, E2s were 660 through 663, and the E3s were 670 through 675. We're beginning our trip by passing through the very small town of LaBelle, Pennsylvania. And to our right, up this hill, is the location of a closed-down strip mine, which was up on top of the flats there, as well as the Fayette Prison, which is a newer structure, a correctional facility for the state of Pennsylvania. It's late afternoon on a warm, sunny day as we're heading north on the Monongahela main line, trying to get the train up to speed here, trying to get traction. I am running the improved physics mod that was put out for the Challenger, but it still has some of the same problems that everyone has always complained about. So you'll see the wheel slip indicator up in the upper left, and for the most part that is to be ignored in this case. Sometimes you'll see the driver slipping, which is when there's actual wheel slip going on. The other time is the small leading and trailing wheels, which obviously are not powered in real life, here on this model in the game, spin on their own, and so when those slip, I get the wheel slip sign. So just have to overlook that for the moment, but that'll go away as we get up to speed. There we go, up to 15 miles an hour now. So I'm going to turn the sander off and pull the reverser back just a tad. Make our cylinders slightly more efficient. On the left, we're passing the LaBelle coal ash pile. This site was originally constructed in the early 50s. To the left was a huge building and a coal conveyor that crossed over the river to the railroad tracks on the other shore in the town of Vestaburg. The site here included a mine dump, a slate dump, and another elevated conveyor that went up the hill over our heads to the right for general waste where it was deposited. Today the site holds over 40 million tons of waste, including coal ash. The site is the target of an ongoing lawsuit because the coal waste is dangerous to the local towns and environment. Here we're passing under the east entrance to the ash pile. Earlier we passed the west entrance. Some other things going on here is monitoring boiler water level and fire mass and adjusting them to sort of keep them in steady state as we travel down the tracks. Sort of the nice thing is at the moment, regulator is wide open, and we're not making major changes to the reverser, so it's much easier to try to get the locomotive into equilibrium with both the fire mass and water level. In the game, boiler water level can basically get down to 0 before your locomotive explodes, which is not something you want to happen. But I like to keep it between 50 and 75%. And fire mass also actually is most efficient between 50 and 75% of your total. So I think our total fire mass here is 1,500 pounds. So we want to keep it between 750 and like 1,000 or just over 1,000 pounds, somewhere in that neighborhood. Doesn't need to be exact, but you don't want so much coal that you quench the fire, and then you obviously don't want so little coal that it's not producing enough steam. Now to the right, just up the hill, pretty close to the tracks actually, we are passing the Maxwell mine, which employed around 1,100 miners and operated from 1919 until 1960. It was one of a dozen medium and small mines in the immediate area and along the river. A conveyor ran down the river from the mine where a tipple loaded barges bound for steel mills. On our left is the town of Maxwell itself, hugging the banks of the Monongahela River. That's a sewage treatment plant over next to the tracks. Maxwell grew up out of nothing as a dedicated mining community after the opening of the mine in 1919. The town was devastated by floods in 1936 and again in 1985. Today, it has been incorporated as part of LaBelle, Pennsylvania. This is the 4th Street crossing, connecting Maxwell on our left to the center of LaBelle up the hill to our right. So we're getting up close to 25 miles an hour, which is the speed limit, but I'm also watching my boiler pressure going down because the reverser and the regulator are so far open. So basically in a moment here I'm going to have to pull the reverser back to maintain speed and also maintain our boiler pressure because we don't want it all to go away. LaBelle Road is paralleling us to the right now, and we're just passing the Maxwell Lock and Dam on our left. The Maxwell Lock was built from 1960 until 1965, replacing an older lock upriver that was removed. The Monongahela River has been locked and navigable since the early 1800s. The name Monongahela comes from the Algonquin language of the Lenape people and means where the banks cave in or erode. This was due to the high banks of the river being unstable and often collapsing due to erosion. The river is 130 miles long, flowing north from Fairmont, West Virginia, to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where it flows into the Ohio River. From Pittsburgh, the Ohio River flows hundreds of miles west until it finally empties into the Mississippi River. The Monongahela drops 3,800 feet in elevation as it winds its way down out of the mountains of West Virginia. The early 1800s brought the Industrial Revolution, a key element of which was the new art of steel making. The Allegheny Mountains were rich in the soft bituminous coal ideal for steel furnaces, so in 1817, Pennsylvania authorized the construction of 16 dams and locks along the Monongahela River. This made the entire river navigable all the way to Pittsburgh with a minimum depth of 9 feet to accommodate loaded coal barges. During the 19th and early 20th centuries, the river was heavily used by U.S. industry, transporting coal from mines in West Virginia and Pennsylvania to the major steel mills in Pittsburgh. The EPA reported in 2010 the Monongahela was the 17th most polluted river in the country due to these industries. That's the Maxwell Dam, just visible through the trees as we're passing by, looking out the side windows up here in the cupola. Boiler water is up pretty high, so I've secured the exhaust steam injectors and the water supply from the tender. On the left, this open space used to be a yard with 7 tracks, though that was reduced by the 1950s, and now of course it's just a single track with a service road over there. The yard ended here just as we came up on the Kelly Run Bridge. And here we cross over Kelly Run as it flows into the Monongahela River. When the train is stopped, our only supply of steam for getting water into the boiler is through the live injectors, but when we're moving, we already have a steam source that's going through the locomotive already, and so we can take steam that's already done the work in the cylinders to move the train, and before it just escapes out of the smokestack, we can direct it through a set of air ejectors that then uses the pressure differential to pull water into the boiler, and that's what the injectors are. We use steam to entrain water, and it shoves it into the boiler, and then after it does its second job, then it can escape out the smokestack. So exhaust steam always preferable to use while we're on the move, because then we're not tapping any additional boiler pressure to fill the boiler, which means all that pressure is still available to move the engine. So especially in times of need, high inclines, where we need the full power of the locomotive, the last thing you want is to siphon off some of that available PSI to fill the locomotive. On the right, on top of the cliffs, was another huge strip mine, which I really couldn't find anything about, but looking at maps, it appears that it opened sometime in the 1970s and then operated at least into the 90s, though now it looks like it's closed down, so maybe within the last 10 or 20 years they've closed it down. It looks like there's nothing there now. In the distance through the trees, you can see we're coming up on Route 43, or the Monongahela Expressway. The Monongahela was proposed actually as early as the 1950s as yet another way to connect West Virginia coal to Pittsburgh industry, supplementing the already existing railroad and river. Construction began in 1973, but was stopped when the steel industry collapsed in the early 1980s. Since then, segments have been completed piecemeal over the years. The bridge we see here wasn't built until 2012. The bridge is named for Ronald Bakewell, a local serviceman killed in Vietnam, and is 3,000 feet long and 200 feet tall. We're getting the wheel slip indicator, but you can see the drivers are not slipping, so we'll just go ahead and turn the sander on. And we'll push forward on the reverser just a little bit. We're up to 24%. Drivers still look good. See traffic going back and forth across the bridge up there. Almost 200 feet above us. There's some coal barges out to our left, sitting on the river, waiting to be filled. As we pass under the bridge, we are now in Alicia, Pennsylvania, and coming up on the Alicia Transshipment Facility on the left. This is originally the site of the Alicia Coke Ovens, built in 1910. Coke is a gray, hard fuel substance which is used in blast furnaces to make steel, and it's made by heating coal with no air at very high temperatures. The Alicia Mine and Coke Works used to have 400 ovens here on site. They converted coal into millions of tons of coke used in blast furnaces all over the country. A tipple in the river loaded barges bound for Pittsburgh, and the siding allowed loading and unloading of trains. The current Alicia transshipment facility that we see here began operations in 2010, now only transferring coal from train cars to barges. So we lost some of our speed, so I've pushed the reverser up to 60%, and so for that reason you can see from the black smoke in here that the stoker is on. I have engaged the coal stoker just a little bit, just a couple taps on the R button to get the worm gear rolling and make sure that we have plenty of power. An automatic stoker is basically a horizontal, what we call a worm gear, which is a long rod that has a spiral cut in it, essentially. And when you activate it, when it spins, it causes the coal to fall down and then follow that spiral, so it actually pushes it horizontally as the rod rotates. So here in the cab, we have a little valve that we turn and open, and it allows steam down to the steam-driven pump, which then turns the worm gear. And so we can use the valve to adjust the speed, which adjusts the amount of coal being fed into the firebox. Alicia Road is snuggling up to us here on the right as we continue north into Brownsville, Pennsylvania, on the east bank of the Monongahela River. Brownsville was an important town as both the headquarters of the Monongahela Railway as well as being the primary connection to its parent railroads, the Pennsylvania and the New York Central. The Brownsville Yards were quite extensive, with 14 tracks, and included a roundhouse and locomotive works. The Bridgeport mine was located near the yards as well, and was also serviced by the railroad. The town was at its largest in 1940, with 8,000 residents. Today, its population is around 2,300. Located in Brownsville, across from its general hospital, is the Horner Memorial Nurses' Home. Hiram S. Horner, who is likely a relative of mine, founded the Horner Coal Company in the late 1800s and ran it with his two sons. One of the Horner mines was nearby, just upstream on the river, and when the last son Joseph died in the 1920s, he left a large sum of money to the hospital in order to construct a new building for nurses' living quarters. On our left, we're passing Brownsville Marine, builder of the river barges used to move coal. The first company here was Hillman Barge in the 1940s, and since then the site has changed hands several times. Even with the ownership changes, the site continued to specialize in barge construction, but also began shipping out steel beams and columns for construction. In 2005, the site was bought by the Heartland Corporation and was renamed Heartland Fabrication. Barges are in much less demand now, so the company has branched out to fabricate girders and other steel components for bridges and other construction. Just after passing Heartland, we hit the outskirts of Brownsville itself. Water Street on our right. On the far side of the tracks, where those storage buildings now sit, was the site of the roundhouse and the locomotive shop. If you look at the site on Google Maps, you can actually see the remnants of the old foundations. You can see the circle and some of the wings that came off for the roundhouse. It's still there, although slightly covered up by these little shacks here. And as we're coming up on the yards, we see several L3s idling. The L class was Monongahela's designation for its 282s, which were the largest size locomotives on the railroad. The Monongahela had 38 L-Class 282s. Its most numerous locomotive were its H-Class 280s, with 62 in service. A handful of small 440s, 442s, and 460s rounded out their roster, and the majority of the railroad's steam locomotives were Alco built. However, Baldwin became dominant in 1952 when the first diesel S12s arrived. The railroad took delivery of 27 switchers, allowing all the steam to be retired by 1954. Later, in the 1960s, 9 ex-New York Central RF-16 Shark noses were added, along with 2 B units. To our right, we're passing the old Brownsville Brewery and Ice Plant. The building was built in 1862, and the brewery operated until 1917. It's interesting to note that because this was a pre-Prohibition brewery, any of its merchandise or advertising is quite rare and worth a lot to collectors. After the brewery folded, the building became the Brownsville Ice Factory, and the building was added onto several times, eventually also including its own boiler house. By 1954, it had its own railroad spur as well, probably for transporting ice blocks up and down the line in reefers. In 1980, it received a major renovation, which is possibly when it was bought by Fashion Cleaners, a dry cleaning company that operated out of the building for many years. Today, it has been renovated to be mostly apartments, though some industrial space is apparently still available. To our left, on the river itself, used to be the location of one of the original locks. Dam and Lock number 5 was just to the north of Brownsville, before the upcoming bridge, but it was removed in the 1960s when a river-wide renovation project replaced or dismantled several of the dams. We're coming up on the Brownsville Bridge, crossing over us and the river to connect with the town of West Brownsville on the far shore. It's a 945-foot truss bridge that opened in 1914, replacing a small wooden bridge that originally stood in its place. Before the wooden bridge, a ferry service originally connected the two communities. Just beyond the bridge, as we come around this building and over the Dunlap Creek, look to our right and we're going to see the Dunlap's Creek Bridge, the very first cast iron metal arch bridge in the United States, built in 1839. And there it is, back up there. Not really that impressive in the game, but in real life that is the oldest cast iron bridge. Now we're moving along the back side of the Market Street shops, which now stand mostly empty but would have been thriving in the 1950s. At the end of the row of buildings is an empty patch that has some interest, and I want to talk about that. There's no evidence of it now, but the Monongahela's Dunlap branch, one of its earliest lines, actually split off from the main line right there in that patch and moved up the hill, behind us and to the right to parallel and follow the Dunlap Creek, heading south. This line opened in 1905 and serviced mines, coke works, and also connected with the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad down south in Lacrone. The line was abandoned in 1975, and there's very little evidence today that it ever existed. It's been covered up quite nicely by nature and new construction. Now we're under the Route 40 Bridge, also called the Lane Bain Bridge, and it was built in 1960 to alleviate heavy through traffic from the streets of Brownsville and across the smaller Brownsville Bridge. It's 2,100 feet long and allows the crossing of the river without having to enter the deep valley. Alright, for the first time we're pushing the regulator forward. We're going to pull the reverser back just a little bit because we need to drop our speed down to 15 miles an hour coming up ahead. Albany Road dips under us, and we're coming up on the Brownsville Junction Wye and a 15 mile an hour zone. And there we go. There we have the yellow signal, and we can see the 15 mile an hour speed sign coming up. So, there's our blower coming on, so I can shut the regulator completely. And you can see the speed is already just plummeting down. I don't even think we're going to have to give it a touch of brakes to get down to 15 miles an hour. Maybe a tad. There, that should be good. We're well under 15 now. We'll open the regulator back up and maintain the 15 miles an hour over the top of the Brownsville Junction Wye here. We have a bit of an uphill, so we want to keep the power on just a bit. To the left is the West Brownsville Junction Bridge, designed and built by the Pennsylvania Railroad in 1882. It no longer exists, but another double track used to come out straight from the bridge to cross our tracks perpendicular and head into another massive rail yard off to our right, also owned by the Pennsylvania Railroad. On the far side of those yards, as the line headed east, was another large coke furnace complex, none of which remains today. Now on the north side of the Wye, and we have left the Monongahela tracks, technically, and we're now on the P&LE Railroad, the Pittsburgh and Lake Erie. In fact, in the 1950s, we would be in the P&LE's yard complex, which ran literally for miles along the east bank of the river here. That made 4 major yard complexes connecting 3 different railroads, right here in Brownsville and West Brownsville. When coal was king, this place would have felt like the center of the world. The Pittsburgh and Lake Erie was a subsidiary of the New York Central, itself part owner of the Monongahela Railway, so getting trackage rights was no problem. Same story with the West Brownsville Yard, which was Pennsylvania territory. Pennsylvania Railroad was also part owner, so Monongahela trains moved easily between all the yards. The usual rivalry between the superpowers was suspended here in this little valley, because the coal was more important than anything, and they were willing to work together to get it. Out to our right is Assad Iron and Metals, a relatively recent scrapyard that filled in some of the space left by the old P&LE yards. So what we're doing here is we're pulling past the Junction Wye up into this whole area, which would have been the P&LE yards, until our caboose clears the Wye. So then we're going to stop, and then we're going to reverse, switching over to cross over the Brownsville Bridge and into the West Brownsville Yards. So we're going to back the train up into the yards, park it on the siding, and then we're going to leave the cars there, uncouple, and then head back to the Brownsville Yards. So I'm keeping the speed up, maintaining 15 miles an hour until we clear these signals up here and get onto the passing siding. At that point, the caboose will definitely be clear of the other switch, so we'll apply the brakes and bring the train to a halt. Bring the regulator open just a little bit more because we're down. Well, now we're coming up to about 12 miles an hour. Heading for 15. Alright, and our caboose just passed that signal behind us, so time to bring this train to a halt. Blower on to maintain an air draft through the locomotive, through the boiler, and the firebox. And once that's open, we can close the regulator, and I'm going to apply train brake. You can see up there on the left side, that's our brake gauge. And then we set the brakes to self-lapped. We'll bring the reverser back to neutral. Open the cylinder cocks to release any excess steam from the cylinders. Less than a mile an hour now. There we go. I think we've come to a complete stop. Single blow on the whistle to indicate that we have stopped. We've got somebody heading out to the switches now to make sure we're going in the right direction. So we're lined up to go through the Y, and we're lined up onto the correct track over in the yards. So full reverse. Releasing the train brake. Cylinder cocks are still open, so as soon as I crack the throttle, we'll see the wet steam coming out of both the forward and rear cylinders. Once the train stops for even just a short amount of time, it's possible that those cylinders would cool down enough that when we reintroduce steam, some of it condenses back to water. And that's the last thing we want, is water in the cylinders, because liquids are incompressible. You could damage or blow out your cylinders, so that's never a good thing. So to prevent that, we open up the cylinder cocks, and it allows any of that water to drain out. So it's not dangerous, and yes, you get a little bit of steam escape along with it, but it's obviously a much better trade-off to lose a few gallons of water to the atmosphere rather than damaging your equipment. And then once the engineer sees that the steam is dry, there's no excess water coming out of it, you close up the cylinder cocks again and be on your merry way. Now that we're backing up, and we have a few minutes to kill, this is the perfect time to ask the question, how did cabooses and locomotives communicate with each other before radio, especially when backing? And there's a couple of answers to that, depending on what railroad you were on and what the situation was. If the train wasn't too long, several brakemen would station themselves along the train, spaced out so that they could relay signals back up to the locomotive. They would ride on top of the cars, or maybe hang off the ladders. This is why you would see the dangling telltale markers hanging over tracks just before a low bridge or some sort of obstruction. In darkness or bad weather, or if a brakeman simply wasn't looking, paying attention, the telltale would warn him to get down. Of course, you wouldn't have men stationed on top of the cars for the entire trip, so the main way that the caboose communicated with the engine was through the brakes. Cabooses had an installed train brake valve, so the brakeman could apply or release brakes. If the brakeman needed to signal to stop, he would engage some or all of the brake from the caboose. The engineer would feel the brakes engaging, and then he'd see his brake pressure gauge increasing, so he would know to close the throttle and apply brakes himself. Once the train was stopped, either lantern signals could be flashed from the caboose, or a brakeman would walk to the head of the train to have a conversation. When backing a long train, such as ours, the engineer would set the throttle to back at a safe speed, and then the brakeman, in the rear, would apply or release brakes as necessary. As for communicating the other way, from locomotive back to caboose, railroads used a series of whistle blasts to give instructions. I think most people are probably familiar with the most basic patterns. 1 whistle means the train is stopped, 2 means about to move forward, and 3 means about to reverse. But far more existed than just those 3, and it was part of a railroad man's job to know what each one meant. When a train had multiple locomotives, for example, the lead engineer would whistle to the others in order to tell them to speed up, slow down, stop, and a whole myriad of other commands. The Pennsylvania Railroad provided an alternative to these methods in 1936, when it introduced the train phone. Locomotives and cabooses were fitted with telephone receivers, and voice commands could be given back and forth in real time. Communication was also possible, for the first time, between other trains, dispatchers, and control towers. Train phones were not a radio system, however. Instead, it worked on the principle of electromagnetic induction, which is the process of creating an electrical current using a magnetic field. The train phone system passed a very low frequency current through either the metal rails or, more likely, the line-side telegraph wires. Pennsylvania cars and locomotives had long handrail-looking receiving antennas attached to them. These would pick up the magnetic disturbance from the telegraph wires and translate that into a corresponding current in the train's handset. The range was only very short, only about 100 feet, but generally the telegraph wires were well within that range. The principle of the train phone is actually very similar to the Navy's sound-powered phone system, except that the electrical impulses were able to be transmitted wirelessly. Due to the design of the system, though, it was useless in electrified zones because of the interference from the electrical power supply and the electrical equipment on board the locomotives. This was a bit of a problem because so much of the Pennsylvania lines were electrified. Even so, the train phone remained in use well into the 70s before being completely replaced by radio. We've come into Brownsville here at the end of this workday. Tomorrow we'll be taking the empty coal train up to the mine to then fill it and then return back down here. That'll be the next 2 episodes. We'll be going up, coming back down. Look at that. You can see the half mile of our train stretching out around the corner behind those trees there across the West Brownsville Junction Bridge. Almost 140 years old now. And again, those double tracks, the straight double tracks, would have been just off to our left, coming out of the bridge, crossing over the main line themselves, going off behind us to the left off to that enormous yard that was tucked into the valley, which now is just completely overgrown with trees, can barely even see that there was anything there. We'll cross over Albany Street, and now we're out over the Monongahela River itself. You just see the tops of a couple of houses up there on the hill in the distance. So this coal has come with us up from Fairview, West Virginia, the southern end of the Monongahela Railroad, and we're going to leave them here in the yard, and someone's going to take them. The Pennsylvania Railroad will come by and we'll take charge of them, and this whole consist will head north on the Pennsylvania rails up to Pittsburgh, where it'll all be processed in some power plant or steel mill, something of that nature. But these are Pennsylvania Yards at this time, and everything up to the north was Pennsylvania, on this side of the river at least. The West Brownsville Yards were built by the Pennsylvania Railroad, which arrived in the town in 1881 through one of its own subsidiaries. Several other small Penn subsidiaries laid track down the west bank of the river, tracks that would eventually be acquired by the Monongahela as part of its Nemacolin and Waynesburg branches. I'll be talking more in depth about those in the next episode, when I'll really break down the details of the railroad's history. Here in this episode, I've been keeping it relatively light as we just sort of learn the basics about the history of the railroad. But next episode, we'll be taking a real deep dive into the history of this railroad and the surrounding area. So now we're good. We're ready for decoupling from the consist. And there it goes. We are now just a locomotive, so train brake is off. Reversers forward. 2 blasts on the whistle indicates moving forward, and we've got the bell on for low speed. Crack the throttle. And we're on our way. We're going to head forward. We're going to cross back over the Brownsville Junction Bridge and head back to the Brownsville Yards on the, what would that be, the east or south side of the river. Gotta watch out though, it's a little bit easier to, or a little bit harder to keep it under 10 miles an hour now. We're just a light engine at this point. Well, I mean relatively light. 2 million pounds isn't exactly my idea of light, but you know what I mean. I mean, we don't have the train with us anymore holding us back, so now it's very easy for the power to get ahead of us. So we'll have to drop back down to 10 miles an hour before we cross over that bridge. We're fine here in the yards. It's back up to 25 on this side. Using the independent or locomotive brake to bring us down. There we go, we're under 10 miles an hour, so then we can release that. And we're out of the populated area, back out in the wilderness, so I think I'm just going to secure the bell now. No need to keep that on. There's nobody around. And we can secure both exhaust and live steam. We're up to 88% boiler level, and we're not going to use much at this point. So we've secured filling the boiler, and I have secured the coal stoking. We're at about 1,000 pounds in the firebox, and we don't need much more than that because we're basically going to park this locomotive. That front articulation going way out to the side. I don't know if in real life the Challenger would be able to make that particular curve. The steam pipes are hinged inside, connecting from the boiler down to that front truck, or the front engine, basically. I don't know if they would swing out that wide. That seemed a little extreme, but we don't have to worry about that here. Again, this is a modern layout, or a modern map that we're sort of pretending is 1950. So you have to let your imagination go a little bit on that, because at the time, in the 50s, 1954 even, and later, like I said, all of these tracks were so different that I think probably they could have accommodated a Challenger had it come through. Because really, that curve back there is the only one I've seen that's really given the Locomotive a bit of an unrealistic look. Maybe it would give it a problem in real life, but that's not how the tracks even were at the time. The curves were much more gentle in the 50s and earlier. In fact, the curve that we took to back into the yard didn't exist at the time. We would have had, if we wanted to back in like we did, we would have had to pull forward to the right and pull into that other Pennsylvania yard, and then back straight across from the yard over the bridge and then into West Brownsville. There wasn't even that option to go around the corner like we did. There was 2 tracks from this direction, from the south, that turned left and intercepted and went over the bridge. So that track that we just took was sort of there, but it was shaped a little bit different. So we're going to see a lot of stuff in the next 3 episodes. Modern vehicles, the modern setup of rails and locations of things, which is not how it was in the 50s. But of course I don't have, without radically changing this map myself, which is not something I have the time or inclination to do, I'm just going to note where things are different in modern times compared to what they would have been in the 50s. For example, we would have seen, just to the left here, the Dunlap branch going off to the left and going behind those buildings on Market Street, and then heading down to the south up into the hills. But of course it's not here, and there's nothing to even suggest that it was here, at the time, except maybe the fact that it's sort of open. That's going to be my mission in these episodes, is to point out where things used to be and how things have changed since then, and maybe see what is still in place now, and just compare it to, almost 100 years ago at this point, early 1900s up into the 50s. Even once we hit the 70s, things started to change at different times. Oh, there's the there's the cast iron bridge again. We're heading back down into downtown Brownsville. Over there on the far bank, we can sort of see the tail ends of West Brownsville. We'll get a nice close-up look at that tomorrow as we head out with an empty coal train, heading up into the hills for Waynesburg. This is the whistle sign for that crossing right at the edge of the yards. So we're going to start slowing down and give a blast on the whistle to go through that crossing. Just the half dozen or so tracks that we see here in this small yard is nothing compared to what it was. Just a huge amount of tracks here on both sides of the main line. That coal mine just off to the left on the far side of the mains, over there in those trees or bushes. Over here to our right would have been the large building that was a locomotive works, and of course directly ahead was the roundhouse. A nice closer look at the Monongahela steam power hanging out in the yards here. There we go, independent brake brings us to a halt. And we're stopped. Full train brake, and we're going to secure this locomotive for the evening. So, there we have it. It's been a long haul from West Virginia this afternoon, but we've reached our destination and we're in Pennsylvania. We're going to secure this locomotive now for the night, as a representative from the Monongahela Railway is no doubt coming out to meet us, and hopefully will bring us to a nice restaurant and show us some lodgings for the evening. Hope you've enjoyed this short hop. Come back for part 2, where we get down into the serious business of breaking down this railroad's history and hauling a train up through the hills at the same time. We'll see you then.